Hi everyone, this is Master Matt, and today we're going to talk about the different types of stretching that exist. I'm going to talk about 5 different categories of stretching, and I'm going to give you examples of each one, and we're going to talk about the benefits as we go through them. I think each one is valuable and useful, and it serves its own purpose in growing your flexibility and your range of motion. So I'm going to touch on that with each example that I provide. But as always, stretching can put you at risk for injury, so make sure you're performing this under the supervision of a coach or an instructor or some other type of professional. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and start by talking about the type of stretching that I do not recommend and that I do not endorse, and that's called ballistic stretching. So what ballistic stretching is, for example, if I'm in my standing hamstring stretch here, if I do ballistic stretching, what I'm doing is I'm basically doing bouncing motions very rapidly and repetitively in the stretch to try and push my current limit of flexibility. And the idea behind that is I'm trying to, just for a split second, get further than where I can currently get, and I'm repeating that over and over again. And hopefully that will stretch my muscles further than they can currently go. And that can work, and you can get more flexible that way, but the problem is it puts you at a high risk for injury. If you think about an old rubber band, if you take that and you start opening and closing it rapidly and repetitively, eventually it's going to snap. So if you think about your muscles and your tendons that way, then you're putting those at risk for snapping or tearing in certain ways, and you don't want that to happen. So I just don't recommend this. The risk is nowhere near the reward. Studies have shown that it doesn't really work anyway. So, I mean, there's probably cases where it has, but I just tell people to avoid this entirely. So the first actual stretching method we're going to talk about is called dynamic stretching. So that means that I'm going to be moving while I'm stretching. So I'm going to go ahead and talk while I'm in the stretch. So I'm going to get into what we know as our groin and hamstring stretch. So I'm going to have my heel on the ground and my other leg is going to be straight. So I'm going to be stretching this hamstring and this other groin. So what I'm going to be doing from here is I'm going to be rotating from side to side in my stretch. So what dynamic stretching is it's stretching in motion, but not to the extent of ballistic stretching. So you see I'm not really bouncing here. I'm just using controlled motions to move between my stretches. So there's several different dynamic stretches that you can do. This is just an example. But this is a really good way to warm up, especially if you're doing a martial art or dancing, gymnastics, or anything that involves a lot of motion, because you're basically preparing your muscles to do what they're about to do anyway. With all the motion, you can do like leg swings and things like this. But it's a very gradual way to warm up your muscles, and I recommend doing this first before you do your static stretches, which are the stationary stretches, because this is just very light. You're not really pushing any limits. You're just moving and getting blood flowing into the regions that you're trying to stretch. So again, that's dynamic stretching. So what we're going to talk about next is called static stretching, which is the opposite, which means I'm going to be sitting or standing still in my position. So we're just going to do the typical seated hamstring stretch for this, and I'm just going to reach down and grab onto my foot. And we know this as just a typical seated stretch. I mean, static stretching just means in general that there's no motion, so I'm just gonna get to a position and hold it. And then eventually I can go further, do several sets of that stretch. I'm gonna switch to the other side. So if I sit here for a while, the muscle will eventually relax and I can go further, and that in turn will increase my flexibility. So this is a very basic but very useful way to become more flexible. I'm going to do the same with my feet together. But there are many types of static stretches and subcategories, which is what we're going to talk about next. But this is just overall static stretching is just any stretch where you're not moving during the stretch. So the next type of stretching we'll talk about is called passive stretching. So it's a subcategory of static stretching we're gonna get into a split. A split is a great passive stretch. So the difference between this and just in general static stretching is I have something forcing me into the stretch. So I have another person either pulling my leg, towards my head, or in this case, I'm having the floor force me to keep my stretch. So the stretch I was just doing, the hamstring stretch, is not a passive stretch because I can just let go and the stretch is over. From here, I can't let go of this stretch without picking my body up off the ground. So there's a force acting on my stretch here, and that's the idea behind passive stretching. So I'm going to turn to the side. Same thing here. This is passive stretching. And the idea behind this is other forces or apparatuses or another person can push you further into your stretch than you can on your own because they're not affected by the stretch. So when I'm doing my seated hamstring stretch, I can only go so far. If I was having somebody push on my back for that stretch, they could potentially push me farther. Now, that gets dangerous, so I wouldn't trust just anybody to do that to you. But something simple like using the floor, you still have control over the stretch. It's just once you get into it and you push it as far as you can't resist it because I can't push the floor. You can think of like wall stretches where you're laying down and doing the split against the wall, or the calf stretch that we've talked about where you hold onto a pole and push back. So things like that are passive stretches, and those can just get you a little bit deeper into your static stretches. So the next type of stretching we'll talk about is called active stretching. So contrary to passive stretching, I'm going to show you by getting into just this leg hold. So I'm going to hold my leg out in front of me here. So what's happening here is there is no force acting on this but myself. So when I'm on the ground and holding onto my foot, at least I'm holding my foot and bringing my body towards my foot. And that's kind of an action that's forcing me into the stretch. But here, if I'm just holding my foot in the air, the only force that's keeping this here is the muscle itself. So I'm gonna do the other side. And what active stretching is really good for is for strengthening. So like leg strengthening, more than just flexibility. The muscles are very engaged throughout the stretch. So things that involve any kind of, like you don't have any help with the stretch is what an active stretch is. So I can do something like, we know this stretch stretches the quad muscle, but if I'm just holding it, you can feel the difference and you have more contraction in your muscles. This is an active stretch here. Same thing on the other side is I don't have the help to pull it. It's not going to be as flexible as if I had a force acting on it, but it has to work harder to keep its position. So the muscle itself is going to be strengthening more to get you more flexible in that region. The fifth and final type of stretching is called P and F stretching, the letters P and F. And this is the most complicated type of stretching. We're going to do a simple one today just to give you the idea behind it. You also hear this as isometric stretching. So first I'm going to sit and I'm going to get into a 90-90 position with my knees. So I'm just going to put my front knee at a 90 degree and then I'm going to put this outer knee at 90 degrees on my side here. So this is a good position for hip stretches. So normally with a static stretch, what I'd be doing is just leaning over towards my knee, and that's going to stretch this bottom hip flexor and the outer hip. But when I'm doing P and F stretching, what I'm doing is I'm contracting this muscle. So what I'm going to do is, you can't see this, so it's not a dynamic stretch because I'm not moving. But what I'm doing is I'm contracting my quad muscle here and I'm pushing it into the ground, like I feel like I'm driving my knee into the ground for a few seconds. And then what I'm going to do is after that I'm going to release, and then this is another layer of it, but that by itself would have been fine. But I'm going to hold my knee down and now I'm going to try and pick it up into my hand. And that's making the muscle work like in an active stretch. And then after a few seconds of that, I'm going to breathe and then relax further into the stretch. So again, I'm gonna drive my knee into the ground with the muscles in my leg for a few seconds. And then after that, I'm gonna try and pick up my knee into my hand. So I'm actively contracting and then relaxing the muscles in my stretch to then get further and deeper into my stretches. So I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. There are so many variations of the PNF stretching, and it's very highly scientific. You can do a lot of research on it. It can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing with this. So that's why I'm showing you something very simple, but there's a lot of things with leg stretches using a band that you can, it's contracting your muscle when you're in the stretch and then releasing it and then driving further into the stretch, actively increasing your flexibility at a higher rate than normal static stretching does. So I'm pushing my knee into the ground first, and then I'm lifting it into my hand, and then I'm going deeper. Again, knee into the ground, knee up into my hand, and deeper. Okay, and you can repeat several iterations of that. It can be called isometric stretching as well, and that just means that I'm contracting and then releasing. Okay, so again, what that does is and that can more rapidly increase your flexibility than just sitting in a certain stretch and then gradually getting deeper will. But it is less safe to do this. I mean, if it's done properly, it works great, but it's just a lot more risky. So you can stick more to the static and passive stretching just to naturally increase your flexibility. But this is just another way and a more rapid way to do that. So those are our 5 different stretching types. We had dynamic stretching, static stretching, passive stretching, active stretching, and then PNF stretching. Those are quick examples, but you can do your own research and look up different stretches in each of those categories. A lot of them are going to look the same. You'll be in the same positions. You'll just be doing different things with your body to use different methods to increase the flexibility in the same regions. But if you're only doing one of these types at the moment, I do encourage you to dip into others and try different ways and see how that affects your current flexibility. Because introducing new things to your body is always a good way to mix things up and keep things fresh and not get too stuck in one routine and stop progressing. So as always, take care when you're exercising, try something new. Thank you guys for watching and keep training.